this issue in terms of, purchasing movies and music online?
The Bruce Willis incident is it's an interesting way to get your message across, and it certainly created a lot of attention for this issue. It's an issue that's been simmering for about the last 25 years. Since the rise of the personal computer, software companies have been licensing their product, namely software, rather than selling it to the consumer. So what we basically buy is a right to use something, and it's very restricted. We're not allowed to resell that right, and we're obviously, as Bruce Willis's scenario has shown us, there's real questions about whether we could leave it in our will to someone else. So they're the kind of questions that are being raised here. Should we be able to take something that we actually purchase and reuse it and resell it, or should the companies that are licensing this information, like software and now music and e-books, should they have greater control over our ability to reuse that and resell our own material?
So in terms of this ownership question, who does actually own this sort of content?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I think it's an issue that's been simmering, and it might be one that's just about to boil over. About 12 months ago, a very senior court in the US called their Ninth Circuit said that they were very firm on the idea that companies were allowed to use this legal mechanism called the licence and restrict people reselling software on eBay. But about a month ago, the European Court of Justice said, we're not so sure about that. We think that people should be able to resell their software, and we're not sure the licence is actually an effective legal mechanism to take that away from people. So we've got a very interesting divide here between the American approach, the European approach, and what our Australian courts might do in the future.
So in terms of the Australian approach, it hasn't really been spelt out just yet where we stand on this?
Look, I think from general principles, we're very closely aligned with the US on this matter, that what we're buying is the licence is the product, and the product is the right to use something. And that's defined by the terms of the licence that you're given. And that's usually very strict, saying you can't resell and you can't do a lot of other things with this item. So we're in that ballpark at the moment, but I think because of our interest in European law, and particularly in UK law, historically, I think it's going to be interesting to see how our courts reconcile this divided legal opinion. And I think there's also a lot of consumer sentiment here. Ultimately, what we're saying is the corporation wants to have greater control over how we use our consumables, and the consumer groups are going to start to say a lot louder, and I think the Bruce Willis viral thing is an example of this. Hey, there are consumer rights here and we want them protected.
Now, in terms of other questions that this particular issue was raised, and in particular I'm talking here in terms of, what happens when we die in terms of content, not just items which we may have purchased, but, things that we may have put on social media sites of our own, be they photos or video, what have you. Where does the line get drawn there in terms of who has control and ownership over those sorts of things, and what happens to them when you're no longer here to make decisions about them?
Yeah, Miriam, that's a really good question. I think there's certainly no uniformity, but I think the way that the big platforms have been going is to say that if you generate your own content and put it up online, you retain the rights to that. Early on, they were trying to claim ownership over some of that, but people got angry and they said, no, you can keep the rights to it, but we want a licence to be able to use that however we want to use it in terms of our own business. So, look, I think largely that sort of issue has not been a long-term problem, and people are relatively happy with that. But I think one of the things that the Bruce Willis scenario raises is what happens when you die? What happens to your social media account when you die? Because a lot of us don't think about that, and obviously when we're dead we wouldn't care about it. But our loved ones, our friends, even our companies may want to know what can they do with social media sites when people die.
Professor Brian Fitzgerald, it obviously pays to read the fine print. Thank you so much for joining us on Weekend Breakfast.
Thank you very much.